The ballroom shimmered with golden light, every chandelier ablaze with candles that reflected off polished marble floors. The air was thick with perfume and whispers as lords and ladies in their finest silks clustered in groups, eager for gossip. At the center of it all stood the prince, tall and proud, his every movement echoing confidence born of privilege. His eyes wandered the hall until they settled upon her. A girl far too simply dressed to belong among jewels and velvet. She had been invited only because she was a distant relative to one of the lesser nobles, and many had already mocked her presence. Yet she stood quietly near the pillars, her hands folded, her expression composed but not meek. Perhaps it was this calmness that irritated him, for he sought amusement. With a sly smile, the prince raised his goblet and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "If you dance this waltz, I'll marry you." The words, sharp and mocking, cut through the air, followed by the ripple of laughter from courtiers who delighted in her expected embarrassment. Heads turned, fans fluttered, and more than one lady hid her grin behind a jeweled mask. To them, it was a cruel game, a jest at the expense of a girl who had no chance of meeting his challenge. She, however, did not flush or falter. She looked directly at the prince, her gaze steady, her lips curving in the faintest of smiles. "I accept," she said softly, but with enough clarity to hush the hall. The laughter stilled, replaced with curious silence. No one expected such courage, least of all the prince. He arched an eyebrow, intrigued but still certain she would stumble. He gestured to the musicians, who struck the first notes of a waltz. Slowly, she stepped onto the gleaming floor, her simple gown brushing lightly against the ground. Every eye in the room followed her, waiting for her to falter, to prove herself unworthy of such boldness. At first, her movements were tentative, her steps light as though she tested the rhythm. Some snickers rose, but they died as quickly as they came. For with each passing measure, her grace deepened. The waltz seemed to flow through her body as though she had been born to it. She spun, glided, and turned with a poise so natural it silenced the crowd. No longer was she the awkward outsider in plain dress. She was transformed into something radiant, commanding the floor with elegance and discipline that spoke of hidden training. The prince leaned forward in his chair, his smirk fading into astonishment. He had expected clumsy missteps, humiliation, perhaps even tears. Instead, what unfolded before him was artistry. She danced not as a novice, but as one schooled in the precision of a ballerina, every gesture balanced, every movement full of expression. Her back was straight, her arms curved with perfect control, her feet gliding as though the floor itself yielded to her. The courtiers who had once laughed now stood speechless, drawn into the spell she wove with nothing but music and motion. A silence filled the hall, broken only by the orchestra, whose playing grew more passionate as though inspired by her. Her eyes lifted, not to the floor but toward the prince, holding his gaze with quiet defiance. In that look was no plea for approval, no trace of fear, only the unspoken challenge, "Mock me now if you dare." The prince's chest tightened unexpectedly, and for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of humility. By the time the waltz reached its crescendo, no one laughed, no one whispered. The girl who had been the butt of a cruel jest had claimed the room with nothing but courage and grace. When she turned in her final sweeping step, the silence was so deep one could hear the last fading note of the violin linger in the air. What had begun as a mockery was now a moment of awe, a transformation witnessed by all, and the prince himself could not look away. The silence that followed the last note of the orchestra hung heavy, as though no one dared disturb the spell she had cast. For the prince, the world had shifted in the space of a single waltz. He had meant to shame her, to amuse himself at her expense, yet standing before him now was not a timid girl in a plain gown but a vision of courage and beauty that defied his arrogance. He had underestimated her. She had looked into his eyes as she danced, never once faltering, and in that gaze he had seen something far more powerful than skill. It was pride, strength, and a quiet defiance that pierced through the armor of his princely pride. The courtiers began to murmur, the spell breaking as fans snapped shut and nobles exchanged astonished glances. But the prince did not hear them. His eyes remained fixed on her as she stood poised, her chest rising and falling softly from the exertion of the dance. He rose from his seat, every movement deliberate, and descended the steps toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted instinctively, watching in stunned silence. She did not bow her head when he approached. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, her eyes meeting his once again with that same steady defiance. It unsettled him, and yet, it drew him nearer. "You were not meant to surprise me," he said at last, his voice low, meant only for her though all strained to hear. "And yet I find myself unable to look away." Her lips curved in a subtle smile. "Perhaps you should not make promises so lightly, Your Highness. Some challenges are best left unspoken." The boldness of her reply struck him like a blade. No woman of court would dare speak so freely to him, not without trembling in fear of offense. Yet she had, and it did not feel insolent. It felt honest. For the first time in memory, the prince found himself humbled, not by force of rank or weapon, but by the quiet dignity of a woman who owed him nothing. The orchestra fell silent, waiting, and still the prince did not step away. Instead, he offered his hand. She looked at it, hesitating, as though weighing the meaning of the gesture. Whispers rippled through the crowd, shock, envy, curiosity, but the prince did not care. At last she placed her hand lightly in his, and he led her to the days where moments earlier he had mocked her. He turned toward the court, his expression unreadable, and then back to her. "I mocked you before them all," he admitted, his voice strong enough to echo through the vaulted chamber. But I was wrong. You dance not like one born of low station, but like one who commands the very air. I thought to humble you, yet I stand humbled instead." His words, unexpected and uncharacteristic, sent a ripple of shock through the assembly. The courtiers exchanged glances, but none dared laugh now. She studied him carefully, as if trying to decide whether his words carried truth or were yet another jest. But his eyes betrayed him. There was no arrogance now, no mockery, only something raw and searching. She inclined her head slightly. "Then perhaps we have both learned something tonight, my lord." The murmurs in the hall grew louder, swelling into disbelief, when the prince took her hand again and raised it to his lips. Gasps fluttered like startled birds through the chamber. For a man who had mocked her, the gesture was nothing short of a declaration. "You have my word," he said solemnly. "What I spoke in jest, I now speak in truth. If you will have me, I will marry you." The hall erupted, some voices crying out in protest, others in astonishment. Nobles who had expected an evening of amusement now found themselves witnesses to history. The girl, plain in dress but radiant in bearing, had captivated the prince to the point of defiance against custom itself. Yet she did not answer at once. Instead, she let the storm of voices rise around them, her silence commanding even greater attention than speech. At last, when the crowd's noise ebbed, she spoke. "Marriage is not a prize for winning a dance, your highness," she said softly, her tone calm but resolute. "It is a promise, and a promise should never be made in jest." Her words silenced even the boldest of courtiers. The prince himself felt them pierce him more deeply than her dance had. He realized then that he had much to prove, not with titles or wealth, but with sincerity. For the first time, he wanted to. He wanted her not because she had triumphed in a moment of pride, but because she had revealed to him his own folly. In the days that followed, the court could speak of nothing else. Rumors spread like wildfire, each tale more embroidered than the last. Some insisted the prince would never honor his words, others whispered that the girl would never accept him. Yet when the prince sought her out again, it was not before a crowd but in the quiet of the palace gardens, where roses climbed ancient stone walls and fountains whispered in the stillness. There, with no audience to watch, he knelt before her. No crown adorned his head, no ladder followed his words. "I mocked you, and you gave me dignity. I sought to shame you, and you taught me humility. I do not ask for your hand to fulfill a promise spoken in arrogance. I ask it because I cannot imagine another beside me who would speak truth to me so fearlessly, who would face the scorn of my court with such grace. If you refuse me, I will still honor you all my life. But if you accept, I will spend that life proving myself worthy of you." Her eyes softened, and at last the hint of a smile curved her lips. She saw not a prince demanding obedience, but a man who had laid aside pride. And in that moment, she gave him her answer, not with words but by placing her hand gently upon his. When the day of their union came, the ballroom was once again ablaze with light, but no laughter mocked her then. She entered not as a girl in a plain gown, but as a bride radiant in satin and jewels, though it was not the finery that commanded respect, it was her. The prince stood waiting, not as a man of arrogance but as one who had been transformed by love. What began as a jest, cruel and careless, ended as a vow witnessed by the court and sealed by the hearts of two souls who had found one another in the unlikeliest of ways. The courtiers who once whispered now bowed, for they had seen the truth. The prince may have chosen her, but in truth, it was she who had chosen him, and by her choice, she had changed not only his heart, but the destiny of the crown itself.